What it was like, you ask, living a life so exceptionally pampered that over 20 fully grown adults hovered about your existence, silently plumping cushions, polishing candlesticks, and ensuring your bathwater hit precisely the temperature of celestial tea. Well, welcome to the great house, my friend, where luxury was so meticulous it practically inhaled on your behalf. The aristocratic households of 18th and 19th century Britain were less like homes and more like finely tuned human clocks. Inside these sprawling estates, Highclere, Chatsworth, or the gloriously overfurnished Blenheim Palace, you'd rarely be alone. Even when you thought you were alone. You might wake gently, sometime between dawn and whenever your valet decided your presence in this mortal world was once again required. He would appear with the silence of fog and lay out your garments, shirt, waistcoat, breeches, stockings, all perfectly brushed, starched, and warmed by the fire, unless, of course, you were a rebellious sort who dared to ask for something casual, in which case you'd still get a cravat so intricately knotted it probably needed its own room on the estate. Downstairs, or rather somewhere several floors below, because one must always be above the help, literally and metaphorically. Your breakfast was orchestrated by the cook, the kitchen maid, and one terrified footman tasked with making sure the toast didn't come out burnt at the corners, which was apparently social doom. Porridge was standard, as was something called kedgeree, rice and fish, warmed in a way that said, "You're part of the empire now, whether you liked it or not." Meals were ritual. Breakfast in the small dining room, of course. Dinner in the large dining room. Tea in the drawing room. Supper in the night parlour. And snacks probably served on silver trays in rooms no one could remember naming. Each had particular cutlery, and each member of staff knew their choreography. Being a majestic human was tiring work after all. Servants abounded in specialized formations. The butler handled wine, brandy, and things too sacred for amateur hands. The housekeeper reigned supreme over linens, soap inventories, and the life cycle of every bar of lavender-scented hand-milled castle soap. A kitchen maid peeled carrots with the tenacity of a Shakespearean understudy, while the scullery maid cleaned, well, everything nobody else wished to touch. Lest you imagine any of this happened in some level playing field of social niceties, no. Servants had ranks. Some termed them staff, but that sounded suspiciously democratic. A footman could not take instructions directly from the mistress of the house unless routed through proper channels, preferably the butler, or perhaps a small committee and a candelabrum. This marvel of bosomed order was powered not just by human anxiety, but by literal bells, rows of them, small and brass, wired throughout the house like nervously twanging wind chimes. Each room had a button. Push it, and somewhere in the servants' hall, a corresponding bell would clang like an offended soprano, alerting the servants to rush, gracefully and on soft shoes, toward your whims. The irony, of course, was that despite being surrounded by people, the aristocrat was often a lonesome figure. Intimacy was a rare privilege in a world that prized hierarchy over hugs. Privacy existed not as a right, but as a zone of palpable discomfort, lightly veiled by velvet drapes and deeply ironic wallpaper. And the cleaning, the dusting was relentless. Ledges, urns, and tassels could not be trusted to remain pristine for longer than a single breath. Polishing silver became a full-time occupation. A single candlestick might reflect the flicker of 40 painstaking hours. Still, there was magic in such homes. Not just in the endless money or the architectural flourishes, but in the tangle of human lives, all interlaced under marble ceilings. The knitting together of duty, drama, and a mustached footman who could balance a tray while dodging a spaniel. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now hush, let's follow the soft clinking of silver down the candlelit hall. Imagine waking up each morning, not to an alarm clock, but to the rhythmic shuffling of starched shoes on polished floors, approaching your bedside like the world's most polite stampede. The curtains don't just open themselves. No, a softly whispering footman pulls them back with ceremonial delicacy, letting in a beam of English sunlight that, as per tradition, contains roughly 40% more mist than glow. Before you've even had time to frown, a maid glides in with a silver tray of tea you didn't ask for, but are expected to drink because it's been curated like wine. The toast, already buttered. The butter, filtered through some sort of dairy aristocracy. Welcome to the domestic ballet of the Georgian and Victorian upper classes, where your home was less of a private sanctuary and more of a stage production where you accidentally held the starring role, and your dressing gown was likely monogrammed by someone else. Living with 20 or more servants was not, as one might think, simply a consequence of wealth. It was a full-blown lifestyle commitment on par with adopting a small but well-trained militia. And in a way, it was. There were soldiers for your wardrobe, cavalry for your cutlery, and footmen who, quite literally, moved furniture to make your life seem impossibly graceful. Let's say you were the master or mistress of a country estate in the mid-1800s. You'd rarely be alone. Not because you were constantly entertaining, but because your own home followed you like a solemn butler-shaped shadow. You couldn't sneeze without someone offering a lace-trimmed handkerchief. And yes, someone was ironing those handkerchiefs daily, by candlelight, while probably judging you quietly from the scullery. Privacy was a curious concept. You might assume the dressing room, into which you retreated each morning before emerging as a fully formed beacon of social readiness, was your own sacred space. Not quite. That room had its own ecosystem, the lady's maid orchestrating the wardrobe, the valet polishing shoes with a dedication bordering on spiritual, the underservant placing warmed undergarments near a fire, as if ensuring the thermal fate of your underpants was one of national interest. Your meals were symphonies of invisible hands. Food didn't appear so much as arrive with fanfare. Breakfast in bed, carried up 3 flights by a footman in livery, what we today might call an outfit that says, "I've never spilled a thing in my life," and accompanied by a timetable of your day as organized by your steward, not you. Ah yes, the steward, the behind-the-scenes puppet master of this domestic theatre. He was the brains of the house operations. Think of him as a human spreadsheet in breeches. He knew how many candles remained in the cellar, which footman was due for a haircut, and precisely when to order more Madeira. He was also the terrifying sort of man who could deduct sixpence from your pay if he discovered a spoon was missing. The servants' hierarchy was a thing of mythic bureaucracy. Your butler may have had more seniority than your cousin Gerald, and with better manners too. The cook, meanwhile, ruled her kitchen with the iron will of a regimental sergeant and the sharp edge of 3 dozen gleaming knives. Don't be fooled by the flour-dusted apron. That was battle armor. Even your dog had a servant. The kennel boy. Yes, someone literally employed to walk the dog, feed the dog, and, in some cases, report on the dog's emotional state, should it seem off its game that day. The sheer volume of personnel trudging through your corridors meant your home life was something between royal procession and household espionage. The servants knew where you were at nearly all times. They had to. Duties were scheduled with more coordination than a military invasion. Your bathwater, for instance, had to be drawn, tested, carried in bucket by bucket from the boiling copper, and then guarded until arrival, lest a curious goose interrupt en route, or worse, it cooled too quickly. Still, despite this constant flurry of domestic choreography, the upper classes were trained to pretend none of it existed. Servants were not to be noticed. They learned to move silently, to be present without presence, like very refined ghosts in starched uniforms. And if you ever thanked one aloud in public, good heavens, what a scandalous display of egalitarianism. So you see, living with 20-plus servants wasn't merely decadent, it was a sort of curated dependency. You were the center of the universe. True. but a universe run almost entirely by other people. Which perhaps begs the question, how did the servants themselves live? Down in those winding corridors beneath the house, behind doors that didn't quite close, with bells that never stopped ringing. Their world was very much alive too, a world we'll step into, just after the bell for the afternoon tea has rung. What most people don't realize about the whole living with 20+ servants situation is that it wasn't nearly as glamorous as the oil paintings insist. You've probably seen those portraits, enormous wigs, decorative dogs, everything either gilded, upholstered, or powdered. But what the portraits fail to show is the fidgeting footman just out of frame, nervously watching toast cool on a silver tray, hoping you'll want breakfast before it becomes history itself. In 18th century aristocratic households, be they nestled in an English country manor, a French chateau, or an aggressively drafty Scottish estate, servants outnumbered the very family they served. Often dramatically, like a 5-to-1 sort of drama. You might imagine this made one feel a bit like royalty, with luxury at your fingertips. And it did. For about 3 days. Then it simply felt like being followed around by a small, underpaid theatre troupe that never unclenched. Even dressing oneself became an event with a supporting cast. It was not uncommon to begin one's day flanked by a valet, a footman, a maid, and occasionally a stable boy who had somehow wandered into the room, quickly offered to fetch something you hadn't asked for, and then was promptly dismissed. The entire process of dressing could take upwards of an hour, not only because the clothes were themselves architectural, but also because the social rules surrounding who tied your cravat or powdered your wig resembled medieval law with decorative lace. Servants themselves were acutely attuned to the unspoken customs of their role. A butler, for instance, was a kind of domestic admiral, protectively guarding the realm of the wine cellar, surveilling the silverware with military precision, and maintaining expressions so neutral that they could have calmed a storm via eyebrow alone. He was not merely serving tea, he was upholding civilization. Maids were divided and subdivided like a taxonomy of clouds. There were ladies' maids, housemaids, undermaids, laundry maids, scullery maids, and, if you were exceptionally wealthy, a still room maid. That's a person whose entire job was to linger in the still room, brewing botanical syrups, jams, and herbal remedies no one remembered requesting, like the warm, herbal ghost of the household. Then there was the footman, that shimmering creature of livery and legs, chosen not just for competence, but for excellent posture and the ability to look whimsically decorative while standing near a door. Their job was to fetch items that were usually 10 feet away and to remain statuesque during dessert should someone suddenly require a second ladle of syllabub. That's right, syllabub, a fluffy, boozy, vaguely lemon-flavored wisp that the upper classes once ate with alarming seriousness. But even amidst the splendor, or what passed for splendor in a drafty mansion with chamber pots, there existed a quiet tension. Every movement, every glance, every sigh was observed, anticipated, measured. If you sneezed, it was someone's job to hand you a handkerchief, someone else's job to collect it, and yet another person's job to whisper mourn the health of your sinuses in the back kitchen. Privacy, in the modern sense, was non-existent. You didn't simply wake up and shuffle to the kitchen for a midnight snack of cold cheese. No, 2 servants had to stoke the fireplaces in your bedroom and corridor before you dared set foot on the chill floorboards. By the time you reached the larder, your valet had already begun. Or, plotting your breakfast, your housekeeper had rescheduled the linen airing, and the cook had been informed that you were evidently a bit peckish and should perhaps be served kidneys at dawn. And yet, despite the sheer performance of it all, many became comfortingly accustomed to the rhythms. Today, we might call it invasive. Back then, it was simply the architecture of life. With every cushion plumped by unseen hands, you were reminded that you were someone. Perhaps not someone useful, but certainly someone important. In such a world where tea cozies had their own assigned closets and the afternoon nap required 2 servants to close the curtains just so, daily life became a kind of theatre. And the greatest irony of it all, the people on stage weren't the actors. They were the audience. Now let's drift gently onward, past the ticking of the hallway clock and down the winding staircase, where below the gilded drawing room, an entire secret world began to stir. Morning in a Georgian country estate begins not with birdsong, although there is plenty of that, but with the soft creaking of floorboards beneath velvet-slippered feet. Somewhere down the corridor, a maid tiptoes past your closed door, balancing a jug of warm water like it's the crown jewels. In a century without running taps, this sleepy ritual is how the upstairs elite were gently coaxed from dreams into satin dressing gowns. Before your eyes have even fluttered open, the great domestic concert begins. Behind every noble yawn, there are at least 3 people plotting how best to arrange your morning. A chambermaid opens your curtains just slightly, letting in precisely the amount of light calculated to rouse, not blind. Meanwhile, downstairs, the scullery maids are locked in mortal combat with pots left over from last night's roast peacock extravaganza. Somewhere in the east wing, the butler pauses mid-polish to remind the footman that, no, his lordship doesn't like the toast crisp. Floppy is preferable. Almost tragic, really. Your bed, which is not so much a mattress as it is a heavily staffed ecosystem, likely requires a team of surgeons in petticoats to fluff and turn. Feather mattresses were all the rage, which sounds lovely until you realize they needed relentless shaking to prevent the household from sinking into a kind of duvet quicksand. The effort spent keeping one aristocratic bottom properly supported would shame an orthopedic department. Now comes your toilette. And no, not that kind. This refers to the leisurely ritual of being transformed from a tangled heap of post-slumber humanity into a vision of powdered elegance. Think of it as the 3-act play of personal grooming, with costume changes and a hint of farce. Your lady's maid or valet lays out multiple options for the day. Morning wear, luncheon attire, walking gloves, afternoon tea cravat, perhaps even catching someone's eye in the orangery trousers. You don't so much get dressed as get curated. At this stage, a rotund footman may arrive bearing a silver tray with your breakfast cup of tea. Milk always added first, and the morning letters. Not that you'll be opening them yourself. That's what fingers are for, and yours, dear noble sleeper, are too valuable for such plebeian folds. Your secretary, likely a scholarly-looking fellow with gently judgmental eyebrows, will be summoned shortly to read the key correspondence aloud in case any of it might prove socially useful or contain references to a distant duchess's gout. Meanwhile, the household wheels turn like a Baroque clock. In this little estate-based universe, everyone has a purpose, and most purposes involve keeping people like you from encountering reality. The head housekeeper ensures the draperies are brushed vertically, not horizontally, because horizontal brushing was thought to disturb the fringe. The cook manages several open fires and still finds time to decide whether the pheasant should be larded or confronted cold. And the laundry maid, a woman with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who's seen too many hand-embroidered linens, oversees a boiling process so aggressive it could clarify most moral questions. You might spend the next part of your morning strolling in the garden, ostensibly contemplating classical virtues, but really just dodging geese and trying not to trip over your own cravat. Here again, unseen labor smooths the way. Gardeners have risen at dawn to rake the gravel in perfect scalloped patterns, a detail purely decorative, since a single misstep renders them meaningless. But oh, the symbolism, a clear path through cultivated chaos, the very essence of nobility. Lunch looms, along with a selection of jelly molds that wobbles with the confidence of gentlemen's clubs. But before you dine, you might take tea with the vicar or entertain a visiting cousin who has brought entirely too many anecdotes about their time. In Italy, your drawing room receives its own careful primping, cushions plumped, harp-tuned, and the faint but intentional scent of lavender water hovering in the air like a well-bred ghost. It's a life entirely designed to ensure you never need to think about how anything actually works. Laundry hangs itself, boots shine themselves, and food appears fully formed. Magic, or at least the closest thing to it in an age of chamber pots and endless cheese courses. And yet, beneath all this comfortscape lies a delicate dance powered by human hands. Tea, brewed just shy of boiling, shoes buffed to moonlight gleam, silence kept so utterly that you don't even realize the world is being stage managed for your convenience. But just as the silver is polished and the pheasant rests, there's another side of this glittery domestic machine, one that stirs not in drawing rooms but in hidden staircases and shadowed servant passages. Next, we'll take a quieter step, behind the green oyster-bar's door into the humming heart of the servant's domain, where the true conductors of your seamless life reside. Of all the things most modern people take for granted, the simple act of nothingness, lounging about in one's own drawing room with a biscuit balanced on the knee, was, in certain eras, a staggeringly choreographed event. In a home staffed by 20 or more servants, solitude was not something you conquered by locking the door. It was something aspirational, like education for women or fresh vegetables in winter. Let us shuffle, slipper-footed, into the 18th century drawing room of an English country manor. The drawing room, by the way, got its name by being the room you withdrew to after dinner, usually from the dining room where the men proceeded to talk politics and knock back enough brandy to heat the windows. The ladies would flow into the drawing room like pastel-clad clouds and sip tea with the simmering subtext of social warfare. But of course, the room was never truly empty. Behind those fragrant wood-paneled walls were ears. Not metaphorical ears, actual ears, belonging to footmen, maids, and the odd governess who, while exiting with her embroidery, conveniently overheard the Duchess of Northerby confess that she'd once waltzed with a baronet in bare feet. Footmen were the primary wallpaper of high society households, employed more for their height and calves than their intellect. They moved about with synchronized dignity, occasionally mistaken by children for ornamental statues, and rightly so. They stood still so long during formal dinners that one footman lost a bet for blinking twice before the spotted dick was served. In the drawing room, their duties involved handing out tea, retrieving dropped fans, and standing nearby with the emotionally intelligent presence of a lamp. If the lady of the house raised an eyebrow, a footman would know whether to summon a tea refill or subtly poison the conversation with a well-timed cough. That's the art of being quietly indispensable while pretending you don't exist. Of course, the drawing room wasn't just for tea and passive-aggressive compliments. It was a stage of social theatre, and absolutely nothing happened by accident. The crackling fire, arranged an hour in advance, the positioning of the chairs, precisely aligned by a housemaid with a hand-drawn seating schematic indicating optimal proximity for flirtation and status signaling. And then there were the maids, often referred to as invisible girls. This was not because they had any magical powers, though they did manage to clean fireplaces without being seen, which is arguably more impressive. Maids were expected to move soundlessly through the house like a well-trained breeze. They polished, dusted, fetched, and fluffed. Fluffing was important. A cushion left unfluffed could ignite a misunderstanding that would echo in society columns for weeks. Now, even though these drawing rooms brimmed with silk gowns and whispered opinions, they also ran on strict hierarchies. If your family was old money, you could recline on a chaise longue and ponder whether hosting a musicale would elevate your social profile. If you were new money, the room was a trap. Every doily, every window treatment, every passive glance became a test you could fail, served with a smile by a footman who knew, with quiet glee, the name of the upholsterer and the scandal involving his third wife. But servants weren't just watching, they were also listening. The term eavesdropping comes from people standing under the eaves of a house to catch conversations. In a home with 20-odd staff, gossip wasn't just passed along, it was curated. Cook might whisper a charge of infidelity to the scullery maid, who would lace the telling with dramatic pauses before filing it away with the butler, who would then subtly adjust gentleman callers' seating arrangements accordingly. This meant that something as simple as talking about your cousin's piano teacher could set off a vibration through the house that eventually reached the stables and convinced the carriage driver that someone was eloping. Cars may go fast, but gossip, in a fully staffed manner, moves at the speed of social doom. And so we find that the drawing room, plush as a confection and hushed as a prayer, was never truly a sanctuary. It was a stage, a spider's web, a carefully monitored habitat where even yawns had subtext and biscuit choices could denote allegiance. But should you wish to escape those 20 watching eyes, those gliding silent maids and footmen with secret allegiances, well, you might consider retreating to the only truly private room in the house. Yes, even in palatial mansions, there was one place where a lady, if clever enough, might seize a moment of solitude. The bedroom, the garden nook. Not quite. We'll find ourselves there next. While the term butler's pantry sounds like something out of a polite dream involving toasted crumpets and polite bowing, in an actual 18th or 19th century household, it was more akin to a sacred zone. A semi-holy sanctum patrolled by the high priest of plate polishing, the butler. And oh, the butler took his domain quite seriously. If you were an aristocrat dreamily wandering the halls of your manor in a velvet dressing gown embroidered with swans or badger crests, whichever family symbol your lineage deemed noble, you might pass the door to the butler's pantry and receive only the faintest of nods. A silent acknowledgement that you, while technically in charge of the household, did not outrank the silverware's security detail. The butler wasn't just a glorified waiter, mind you. He was the custodian of the silver, the mastermind of the wine cellar, and often the unofficial secretary of household secrets. If Miss Caroline's letters were being scented just a bit too sweetly before posting to the stable boys, "Hey, my cousin," well, the butler knew, and he probably fixed her punctuation too, before sealing it discreetly with a family crest wax stamp. Like all great generals, the butler had a war room. The pantry was more than a cupboard with crackers. It was storage, office, and command center rolled into one. There were polished drawers containing regimentally arranged cutlery, each piece with a designated slot like tiny aristocratic swords at the ready. Silver tea sets gleamed under the butler's rhythmic polishing, preferably while he wore white gloves and a facial expression of modest disdain toward anyone who dared mention tarnish. Security was paramount. In many grand homes, the silver remained locked up in the pantry overnight, and only the butler possessed the key. Sometimes, to deter any treacherous scullery rebellion, the butler would go so far as to sleep in the pantry, either on a cot or, more often, by simply dozing upright in a backless chair, defiantly upright, like a falcon wearing a tailcoat. Now for the curious aristocrat, or at least the ones who still remembered how to pour tea, entering the butler's domain required diplomacy. You'd knock, softly, and the door might creak open just enough for the butler's eye to appear, like a very proper barn owl. Permission granted, you'd step in, trying not to knock over any petty cash ledgers, or heaven forbid, place a sweaty glass on the polished surfaces. "Good evening, sir," the butler would say, his voice measured, neutral, and always 3 degrees cooler than room temperature. "Ah yes, Perkins. Terribly sorry, but has anyone seen the tiny sugar tongs shaped like dolphins?" They were cleaned and placed in the second drawer to the left of the middle drawer. Below the small bronze bell, he'd respond without blinking. And you'd believe him, because one did not argue with a man who catalogued teaspoons by handle curvature. Butlers also maintained the wine cellar's sacred order. And woe betide the unsuspecting guest who reached for a white with their roast duck. It was the butler, gliding silently into the dining room, who would arch one eyebrow in such a way that suddenly everyone realized they'd made a terrible mistake, but would never admit it. Meanwhile, the rest of the house bustled like a beehive run by people in aprons and heavy skirts. The laundry maids whispered secrets between linen folds, while footmen practiced standing in complete silence for hours, as if auditioning for a portrait. But deep within the bowels of the house, there sat the butler, sipping tea that was always perfectly steeped and updating the household accounts in a ledger thicker than most novels. It's worth noting that while upper-class families had heirs and legacies, the butler had continuity. He often outlasted a generation or two. When children grew up and took over the manor, the butler remained, a steady constant still polishing the same silver ladle he first encountered during the reign of 4 hairstyles ago. By now, as candlelight flickers off the long hallway outside the pantry door, and the sound of the final teacups being rinsed echoes from the scullery, we tiptoe gently away from the butler's realm. We leave him there, scribbling in his ledger, ensuring that every last spoon rests exactly where it ought to. And up the grand staircase, where velvet drapes sway with the nighttime draft, we'll turn our sleepy gaze toward the bedrooms, sumptuous retreats where privacy arrives dressed in layers of goose down, tassels, and, of course, monogrammed nightcaps. In the grandest homes of the Georgian and early Victorian eras, privacy was a concept as foreign as a good dental plan. For the well-heeled elite nestled within their sprawling country estates, or cloistered in their marble-floored London townhouses, there could be no such thing as alone time. Not truly. Even thinking in solitude had to be scheduled between staff, entrances and unexpected string quartets in the drawing room. Because you see, when you had more servants than you had socks, you were never really alone. And when a household employed over 20 domestic staff members, possibly more than the entire population of a nearby hamlet, they were not just tending to your needs, they were observing you. Always. Take, for example, the curious case of the dressing room, a room dedicated exclusively to the act of being dressed. One might imagine the guest of honor in this daily ritual is you, and you alone. But oh no, dressing was a team sport. The valet or lady's maid, depending on your status and your wardrobe's complexity, would arrive promptly with the garments of the day, laid out like a Michelin-starred tasting menu. Corsets steamed, spats brushed, lace unwrinkled to a degree that would stress a modern dry cleaner. The elite personage would rise, often with the help of yet another servant, bringing hot water, warm towels, and a morning beverage. The beverage was often chocolate. It's important you know this. Our ancestors began their morning by drinking chocolate, not because it was efficient or energizing, but because aristocrats were basically toddlers with wigs. And once risen, the choreography began. For ladies, the act of being laced into a corset could take several minutes, sometimes much longer if the previous evening involved a particularly daring pudding. The lady's maid would pull and tug with an expertise passed down from generations of highly discreet yet muscle-toned women. Meanwhile, hair was being braised and baked into improbable shapes, petticoats were fluffed like soufflés, and jewelry was pinned into place with the delicacy of bomb disposal. But what's worth remembering here is not the complexity of the outfit, impressive though it was. No, it's the fact that none of this was done alone. Your daily transformation from tousled dreamer to powdered dignitary was a group effort, complete with commentary, judgment, and the occasional passive-aggressive remark about the state of your stockings. And stepping outside your room didn't improve matters much. You were greeted in every hall, like royalty, returning from a long voyage. Bowing footmen, curtsying maids, a butler forever materializing just over your left shoulder, like a Victorian ghost trained in wine pairings. Even your letters weren't safe. If you thought you could pen a scandalous note without the housekeeper noticing the scent of your sealing wax or the unusual timbre of your size, you were sorely mistaken. Servants cleaned inkpots and arranged quills. They changed blotting paper. They knew. And though etiquette demanded discretion, human curiosity has always run faster than custom. It's entirely plausible that a savvy footman knew more about the Earl's romantic missteps than the Earl's own wife. Perhaps no moment was more illustrative of this omnipresent observation than mealtime. Grandee households ate on schedule, with more ceremony than a royal coronation. The dining room's heavy doors would be opened by invisible hands just as the master or mistress approached. Napkins were folded into origami swans, long before Japan made it fashionable, and decanters gleamed like mystical goblets. Yet seated at your place of honor, you were not truly at the top of the food chain. Behind every forkful stood 6 pairs of eyes, polishing, pouring, resetting dishes between bites with the grace of pickpocketing ballerinas. If you spilled your soup, someone would catch the spoon mid-tumble. If you raised your eyebrow, a footman 12 feet away would silently slide your preferred chutney into position. It was, without exaggeration, performance art, and your every gesture was part of the act. And heaven help you if you left your chamber in your nightshirt, although in several documented cases, men of leisure did just that, sauntering out at noon in nightcaps and slippers as if pajamas were a mark of intellectual depth. The staff would, of course, pretend not to see. But meanwhile, somewhere between the scullery and the smoking room, jokes would be quietly penned for the servants' annual Christmas pantomime, a treasured event notorious for its razor-sharp impersonations of the household's more eccentric tendencies. Yet for all their quiet omnipresence, these servants formed the beating heart of the home. Their tasks, though various and infinite, were coordinated like a symphony. One overly crisp toast at breakfast could send ripples through the entire day. They cleaned without being seen, appeared when needed, and listened to arguments echoing through closed doors with the detachment of seasoned diplomats. Tomorrow, perhaps we'll peek into one such door. The kind with monogrammed initials and mysterious perfumes seeping through the keyhole. Imagine it. Your morning begins not with the soft chirp of birds or the lazy rays of a sunbeam pressing against your cheek, but with the whisper of footsteps on polished mahogany and the quiet creak of an impossibly quiet door hinge. Before your eyes open, even before your dreams have had the decency to end, a housemaid, with professional stealth, has already unlatched a window for fresh air, laid out your garments like a museum exhibit of silk, lace or wool, and positioned your slippers inches from the side of your bed, facing east, as per custom. Now, before you muster your first coherent thought of the day, another servant appears, the morning footman, bearing a tray of tea, a soft-boiled egg under a silver dome, and a small note from the butler. Not a love note, mind you, something more chilling. Breakfast will be served in the blue dining room at 9:30. Her ladyship has requested your presence. A quiet panic sets in. You'll need to dress, freshen, maintain conversation, and chew, all with limited facial expressions and excellent posture. Living with over 20 servants wasn't merely a sign of wealth in the grand country houses of 18th and 19th century Britain. It was a lifestyle that turned one into a curated exhibit of human excellence and etiquette. Every move felt vaguely observed, and often was. There were servants to light the fire, draw the bath, and remove the family goose from the water if it had taken a morning swim, polish the boot buttons, and fluff the hairbrushes. That's right. Fluffing a hairbrush was an actual duty, though perhaps not one officially written into a contract, likely filed under miscellaneous fineries, along with occasional bird chasing and advance warning of distant aunts. Now, the key psychological component of living with this many people attending your every need is not the luxury itself, though the hot cider foot soaks were delightful, but the curious emotional disconnection from your own daily competence. Everything simply happened without you. Brevity, spontaneity, these weren't encouraged. Suddenly deciding to go for a frolic in the field might send the gardener into cardiac collapse. Changing your breakfast preference without a fortnight's prior warning. That sort of talk would require a memorandum and a light apology to the scullery maid. And don't think privacy existed in this equation, not in a practical sense. Bedrooms were ceremonial during the day, populated by staff ensuring the bed's creases were symmetrical. Writing rooms often had someone silently dusting behind you, as you penned very delicate feelings into a tiny poetry journal. Even your moments of rest were shared. Your bath had a bath attendant. Your wardrobe changed based on the viewing schedule of guests. You were not just a person's anymore. You were an event. Yet, there was comfort in the rhythm of it all. The house operated like clockwork, and you were both the tick and the tock. The valet adjusted your collar and reminded you that Lady Margaret preferred you wear your hunting watch. The butler made sure your newspaper was folded just so, never opened, lest you be burdened by the tragedy of its layout. And the cook, the cook, prepared your meals 3 days in advance and in triplicate, just in case you invited a duke or offended one and needed chocolate as reparations. It sounds stifling, and in truth, it often was. But for the leisured gentry among whom this circus of domesticity unfolded, there was also a peculiar sense of safety, like being cushioned from the world by layer upon layer of lace and civility. If a letter was awkward or sad, the butler could simply lose it temporarily. If the rain was too wet, the indoor conservatory could provide misty ambience minus the sogginess. Living with 20-plus servants meant never cooking your own omelette, true. But it also meant never burning your own omelette, never cursing the skillet, never throwing it out of a window in a fit of culinary despair. Still, the walls tended to listen. One couldn't mutter in frustration without 10 boot-polishing ears picking it up. There wasn't much room for a secret in a house that had a servant whose title was literally the listener, usually euphemistically named Mr. Evans, who always happened to be present whenever family meetings occurred. It makes you ponder how emotions survived amidst all that protocol, how whispered love confessions didn't get caught in the steam of tea trolleys and reappear as gossip in the pantry. But it's in those quiet, candle-dimmed evenings, after the 4th course of dinner has concluded, and the footmen linger ghost-like in polished shoes and white gloves, that the household settles. The air smells faintly of lavender pressed into curtains and firewood crackling behind gilded grates. And there, in the hush of that curated perfection, you begin to question something subtle. What was it like for those servants, wandering the edges of someone else's world? Well, let's step quietly into their hallway. No need to knock. They never did. In the great houses of the 18th and 19th centuries, privacy was more of a literary ideal than a lived reality. Behind the velvet drapes, beneath the parquet floors, and sometimes peering through cleverly disguised servants' doors, were the eyes and ears of the domestic staff, your endlessly present, finely choreographed, and extremely well-informed entourage. If you so much as sighed in the breakfast room, a footman was already checking whether your usual jam displeased your sensibilities that morning, or whether it was one of your quieter existential crises. Let's examine a curious phenomenon. You, the master or mistress of the house, were in fact the last person to know anything about yourself. Your valet or lady's maid had already told the housekeeper about the new tear in your silk cuffs. The housekeeper relayed it to the laundry maids, who, while elbow-deep in a vat of lavender-scented soap, gossiped that your nerves seemed unwell lately. Poor dear. By the time you sipped your evening cordial, your entire household staff had diagnosed your soul's condition and recommended intervention, usually involving a fortnight in Bath. But it wasn't entirely their fault. Homes were built for this sort of surveillance. Servants' corridors were hidden behind walls, running parallel to the main halls of the house like secret streams, allowing cooks to pass unnoticed and butlers to appear in drawing rooms just a fraction too early to be comfortable. Their arrival seemed timed not to your bell-pulling, but to your pulse. In Great Britain especially, upper-class homes in the Georgian and Victorian periods had something called a bellboard, a charmingly complex tangle of wires, bells, and little plaque labels that let servants know in which room one desired their immediate attendance. The trouble was, in a mansion with 43 rooms, guests with overactive thumbs could lay siege to the staff with ringing orders, as if the Battle of Trafalgar were taking place in the drawing room. There were even junior footmen whose sole job was to relay messages. Not verbally, mind you, but in the form of small silver salver notes. You might write a missive requesting your favorite armchair be moved 2 inches left. For the light, darling. Fold the note with a practice flick of the wrist and send it gallivanting across the house via a uniformed boy who likely sighed in verse. And if you were under the impression that you could sneak about your own home without being observed, you adorable creature, you were most certainly mistaken. Servants passed information in murmured clumps, gossiped by coal scuttles and linens, interpreting your footsteps like omens. "Did you hear?" they'd whisper from pantries and sculleries. "She took her tea on the west veranda instead of the rose garden." Something's awry, I say. A change in location, a different shawl pattern, even a longer than usual silence at luncheon. It was all magnified beneath the household's internal microscope. Bedrooms offered little solitude, for even dressing was an ensemble production. Your valet or lady's maid carefully orchestrated your transformation from nightgown to daywear, complete with starch, brocade, and shoes laced by someone else's steady hands. You were a living doll in your own home, forever being arranged to best reflect the house's reputation and your own illusion of grace. If by chance you slipped away for a moment of solitary contemplation, a moonlit stroll, a brooding window sit, maybe even something radical like solitude, there existed at least 3 people whose job it was to subtly check in on you, usually under the guise of carrying a candlestick or a fluffier blanket than strictly necessary. Now one might ask, did the masters and mistresses of these houses mind such constant company? Or did they simply adapt to domestic omnipresence in the same way one adapts to the sound of waves while living near the sea? Ever present, vaguely soothing, and impossible to hush. Life in a grand household wasn't claustrophobic. It was atmospheric. Like living inside a bell jar woven from lace, where your every need was met before you knew you had it, and every sigh might cause a cascade of activity from the hidden world behind the curtains. And as bells chimed softly in distant corridors and wool-clad footsteps padded down narrow back stairs, one question rang as clearly as the drawing room bell. Who, among all those silent watchers, really knew you best? It is a question that lingers, like the scent of beeswax and lavender, in the shadows of a high-ceilinged chamber. Now, with the flame of your bedside candle burning low and the evening supper dishes finally whisked away behind double doors, let's tiptoe a little deeper into the inner workings of household theatre, where honor met hierarchy, and where the butler always knew just a bit too much. If you were a Georgian aristocrat, or simply pretended to be one until people stopped questioning it, then your mornings were not yours to keep. From the moment your eyelids fluttered open, usually to the scratchy warble of a footman's awkward cough or the faint clink of polished tea trays colliding with wall moldings, your day would begin not with peace, but with people. People in starched collars, people carrying towels, people with trays of toast you didn't ask for but would very much appreciate in about 7 minutes. By the time you emerged from the comforting warren of your 4-poster bed, you were already under observation. At least 3 servants had likely passed judgment on your snoring, and one had absolutely told the others, "You're a mouth breather." This is why the upper classes so frequently developed a vague and permanent expression of distant curiosity. It wasn't mystery. It was exhaustion with never being alone. The first person to greet you, or rather, the bravest among the downstairs multitude, was usually your valet, if you were a man, or a lady's maid, if you were a woman. These were the elite among the servant class, the Michelangelos of button fastening, the Rembrandts of hair parting. Your valet knew the full sequence of your wardrobe better than you did, and perhaps even better than its original tailor. A dignified gentleman required no fewer than 5 separate pieces of clothing before he was deemed fit to stagger toward the breakfast room. Shirt, waistcoat, trousers, neckcloth, and coat. And that, assuming a relaxed day without guest appearances or dueling invitations. Your valet dressed you like a sentient croissant, folding layers with precision. If he sighed while tying your cravat, it was not out of despair. It was art. Meanwhile, the lady's maid was presiding over a ritual so complex it would impress NASA. Your hair was curled with heated irons that closely resembled medieval torture instruments. You were laced into stays so tightly they could realign your spine and crush your ambitions in under 5 minutes. And all this time, you did nothing. You merely stood like a half-animated mannequin while someone turned you into the most presentable version of yourself, or a fainting goat in satin, depending on the humidity. During this process, conversation was not only allowed, it was encouraged, but exclusively about illnesses vaguely acquired from travel or drafts. The gentry above stairs loved talking about their spleens. "Brompton air doesn't suit my complexion," you'd murmur to your lady's maid, who already knew. She'd nod solemnly, as though Brompton were notorious for interfering with healthy bile production. Once decently spooled into your garments, it was off to breakfast, which was less a meal and more of a performance. You arrived to a buffet table groaning with roast kidneys, glazed ham, deviled eggs, cold cuts, fresh rolls. Was marmalades, and at least one item that wouldn't make sense even if you weren't foggy from a poor night's sleep. Eating lightly was a sign of refinement. Consuming more than 2 eggs risked appearing gauche. If anyone asked how you slept, you were to say, tolerably, even if your pillow had attempted to suffocate you. Now here's where things get truly intimate. While you spooned haddock onto your porcelain plate, an invisible army swirled around you with disruptive politeness. Footmen in tailcoats, hair slicked into conformity, waited exactly 18 inches behind your chair, prepared to pour, fetch, or vanish, depending on your mood. The butter was buttered for you. The coffee was poured before your hand reached the pot. A napkin would be replaced mid-chew, freshly pressed and folded by someone who hadn't seen daylight in weeks. And if you dropped something, oh, heaven help the person who tried to pick it up themselves. That would disrupt the choreography. No, servant would ghost in, retrieve the fallen fork as if extracting a dagger from a stone, and vanish again before your fellow diners could pretend not to have noticed. You were not allowed to move abruptly or be useful. That was the system. Even your reading of the Times was an orchestrated effort. A boy might bring it in on a silver tray, as though hot gossip from Parliament required silverware. Occasionally, you'd reach for it only to find the butler silently adjusting your chair so that the early sun didn't strike your eyes. Helpful, yes. Disorienting, always. And all this bustling, bathing, brushing, buttoning, buttering, happened before 10 a.m. Luckily, the post-breakfast hours promised a velvet-clad kind of peace, that soft and serene window where servants turned to cleaning the drawing room, and you, if you were wise, simply strolled into the solarium and pretended to be engaged by a fern. But just beyond that fern, more rituals awaited. The social calls, the letters, the never-ending cycle of invisible gears turning to preserve the illusion of effortlessness. And in that illusion lived yet another secret. The drawing room. That splendidly underused chamber of aristocratic homes where nothing is truly drawn and no one ever quite seems sure what to do. Perhaps you've been imagining your noble self reclining gracefully therein, wrapped in crushed velvet, sipping something suspiciously herbal, while fireplace embers crackle in stoic British Morse code. But let's set the scene properly. The year is somewhere between powdered wigs and penny farthings. You're wearing something impractical, but expensive, possibly brocade, almost certainly itchy. The drawing room is where the fortunate few gather for conversations that spiral gently toward nowhere, accompanied by the muffled bell chimes of unseen servants bringing plates you didn't ask for. Yes, the drawing room, where you can't so much as sneeze without at least 2 footmen adjusting your cushions and a third quietly offering you sneeze-themed embroidery. Now, in a household blessed, or burdened, with over 20 servants, the very act of lounging is, in fact, supervised. Nothing reminds one of their status quite like a room full of people whose entire job is to pretend you're the most interesting thing since horseradish paste. Mrs. Whitcomb, the housekeeper, might glide by now and then, checking that the silverware atop the mantelpiece is exactly 3 degrees to the right. This was her way of ensuring domestic harmony and, likely, of confusing the under-butler. And let us speak now of the under-butler, a gloriously ambiguous title, suggesting both subservience and sneaky power. Like all good under-butlers, Mr. Ridley existed primarily in whispers. You rarely saw him, but you felt him. The sudden fluffing of a velvet cushion, Ridley. The quietly relaced slippers, Ridley. The inexplicable scent of lemon-scented justice in the air. One mustn't rule it out. In the drawing room, it's important that everything feel effortful, yet effortless. That illusion, dear listener, took 17 employees. Each morning before you emerged, the furniture was brushed. Brass candlesticks were persuaded into a state of photogenic tarnish, and fires coaxed into the perfect, "we don't need this, but isn't it lovely?" aesthetic. And as you sat in your armchair, the good one, not the copycat near the piano, you weren't alone. Through discreet peepholes and half-cracked doors, eyes were watching. For safety, yes, but also because Mr. Forthingay, the younger footman, was convinced you'd drop your biscuit, and he'd rehearsed a 10-step rescue mission involving a doily and a silver fork. Even the dog was managed. You see, aristocratic dogs were not just pets. They were status symbols with specially woven coats. Mrs. Toodle, your overly dignified King Charles Spaniel, had her own servant, a lad, whose only task was to ensure she neither overexerted herself nor, heaven forbid, tangled her ears in the embroidery. Entertainments in the drawing room were choreographed events, requiring servants to double as stagehands. Should you mention the desire to hear music, the second footman would slip away silently, alert the music room, nudge the scullery maid into summoning the pianoforte master, and within 10 minutes, you'd pretend to be surprised and delighted by an impromptu sonata. And if conversation dwindled, as it did between people who took 4 hours to express mild dislike of a pie, the tea service would arrive, pouring warmth and distraction back into the room. Every sugar cube placed with such care, it seemed to take a lifetime. But what else were you doing? Besides performing the exhausting theatre of gentility. Of course, it must be remembered that the drawing room was not only the realm of guests, it was also the battleground of social strategy. Seating, arrangements were diplomatic statements. Too close to the fire meant you fancied yourself central to the household. Too far from it, and you risked shivering into irrelevance. Placing your sherry glass on the wrong side table could cause a feud so silent and so posh it might never be spoken aloud, merely passed down the generations via disapproving glances. And still, when the gas lamps glowed just right, and the murmurs softened into gentle laughter, there was something spellbinding about it all. The illusion of grace, perfectly curated. The warmth, not just from the hearth, but from the ritual of being gently watched over, not for suspicion, but from loyalty, tradition, and the hope you might drop a scone again. As the evening hours pressed on and the light softened into a syrupy amber, eyes grew heavier, powdered wigs slightly askew, and someone, somewhere in the house, began drawing the curtains in another room, signaling the gentle winding down of yet another oversized, aristocratic day. And speaking of the rooms where servants lingered just out of earshot, next, we might quietly step into the curious world of the servants' hall, where ranking didn't end just because the uniforms were starched. By the time the sun rose over the east wing of Greystone Manor, the housekeeper had already been up for hours, as had the second footman, the scullery maid, and the under-gardener with the unfortunate moustache. The household was a humming hive of hierarchy, and each role nested precisely in the tower of domestic formality that served the noble family like a living organism wearing waistcoats. In the world of grand houses, roles weren't jobs. They were identities, stitched snugly to one station in life like a name tag embroidered by destiny. Being a scullery maid, for instance, didn't simply mean washing pots. It meant you belonged to the hidden, steamy gut of the house, scrubbing copper pans so furiously that your dreams were flecked with the scent of lye. One didn't move lightly between roles unless tragedy struck, like the upstairs maid eloping with a lute player, leaving her post and her feather duster behind. Now, while the modern world has confused hierarchy with hostility, households of the 18th and 19th centuries operated like small monarchies, not tyrannies, a la terrifying overlords, more like ceremonial dances with a hint of foot fatigue. Each servant had a set of tasks that bordered on the poetic in their specificity. The butler, for example, wasn't just pouring the wine. He was managing the cellar, overseeing the silver, regulating the evening mood one clink of glassware at a time. A performance artist in black wool. It was quite possible to live in one of these massive estates and never pour your own tea, select your own shoes, or, heaven forbid, lay hands on firewood. One might go entire weeks without seeing the entire household staff in unison, though one certainly heard them. Footfalls above, flourishes of linen being shaken in the corridor, the disapproving cough of the valet when you try to wear last season's riding gloves. The social ladder was so detailed, so obsessively ranked, that even among the servants, there were servants to other servants. The lady's maid had a maid. The butler had footmen. And the cook, oh blessed sorceress of the kitchen, had a loyal tribe, each chopping, peeling, and flaming under her command like in flour-dusted elves in sensible shoes. It all might sound a bit indulgent, perhaps surreal, but to the aristocrats born and bred within these velvety walls, this choreography of duty was the drumbeat of normalcy. One didn't consider why the cucumber sandwiches appeared at exactly 3:58 p.m. They simply did, and if they bore no crusts, then all was right with the cosmos. And yet, despite appearances, domestic service wasn't all whispered footsteps and polished brass. It was also gossip, hardy and generous gossip passed hand to hand from pantry boy to dairymaid. The goings-on of the upstairs world were devoured like novels, with characters you knew personally and plot twists that included fainting spells, inconvenient engagements, and once, a goose that infiltrated the drawing room. Relationships between servants could be complex, alliances and rivalries as rich as any dramatic miniseries. Sometimes the butler played benevolent patriarch, steady and omniscient. At other times, he was more of a chess master, bending the house to his will, one rearranged dessert fork at a time. Did anyone truly enjoy being followed about by a small army of attendants? Strangely enough, some did. Hosting guests became theatre, dinner, a multi-course migration of status symbols. Every silver dome removed in unison, revealing a perfectly constructed roast, or more daringly, an aspic, trembling with equal parts ambition and gelatine. There were others, of course, who longed for solitude, a stolen moment by the fireplace, a cloak, flung on a chair without reprimand, bread torn by hand rather than sliced with propriety. These little rebellions were rare and delicious, like jam smuggled into the bedroom past the vigilant eye of the hallway maid. But mostly, this was a life of formality in all its curious pageantry. A life where every meal, every garment, and every note of chamber music required a dozen invisible hands to make it feel effortless. Just below the polished surfaces, behind the closed doors of linen cupboards and wine cellars, those hands never rested. They ironed, dusted, basted, and turned the gears of an existence so meticulously managed, the nobility could drift through their lives in a drowsy fog of china patterns and scheduled promenades. And what of the rare moments when that fog lifted? When the master of the house noticed the hands behind the curtain, or when a maid met a gaze not meant to be met? Ah, those moments were softer, less scripted, and altogether human. But those are stories for another hour. For now, the candles are being snuffed one by one, the hallways swept clean of footsteps, and somewhere, someone is fluffing 9 pillows for a bed that will be slept in by just one. let's tiptoe onward, past the pantries and plum puddings, toward quieter places yet. Evening in the grand house arrived not with a bang, nor even really with a whisper. It came with the hushed rustle of silk skirts, the soft ladder stitch of slippered footsteps across imported rugs, and the discreet clink of a decanter being gently unstopped. It came with the soft toll of the drawing room clock, marking the close of another day, spent under the unblinking eye of 20-something liveried onlookers. One might think that a lavish aristocratic house of, say, 1810 began to quiet down as the sun slipped behind the hedgerows. But not quite. Not if you were part of the elite class whose social life operated almost exclusively once the sky turned stuffed velvet navy. It was known, after all, in homes of any societal girth, that one did not simply relax for the evening. No, one ceremonially descended into evening, figuratively and sometimes literally, down a grand staircase built entirely to impress people you didn't even like. And here, dear listener, is where we meet the evening ritual, dressing for dinner. Now, to us modern folk, dressing for dinner might imply slipping on a hoodie that doesn't have food stains on it, perhaps even socks that match. But to the upper classes of the Georgian and Victorian eras, dinner was not only the most formal meal, it was also a mini-theatrical production, and dressing for it was the overture. For gentlemen, this meant brilliant waistcoats, high collars starched to structural levels rivaling municipal architecture, and cravats wrapped and tied with the divine precision of a sailor gifted in knotwork and passive aggression. A valet, of course, performed this ballet for them, selecting fabrics with seasonal sensitivity, recommending the correct shoes for the menu: veal, patent leather, salmon, something with an understated buckle, and ensuring the master's hair was tousled just enough to suggest effortlessness, but also sufficient funds to pay others to achieve it. Ladies, meanwhile, were engaged in an even more elaborate metamorphosis, often with an entire pit crew of devoted dressers, who were generally more capable than today's Formula One mechanics, and statistically less likely to yell. Gowns were selected with deadly seriousness. Evening dresses often bared the shoulders, daring society to have feelings, and were festooned with embroidery, lace, and occasionally enough pearls to create a plausible maritime accident if tipped overboard. Hair was shaped, reshaped, and occasionally began to resemble architectural sketches of domed churches. Scented oils were applied, rouge dabbed on with a manner that suggested youthful exuberance, even if your knees creaked audibly. While, of course, your small army of servants observed you in varying degrees of invisibility. Some were skilled in precisely vanishing from the room just before your corset cut off your oxygen. Others hovered, seemingly assigned the role of lamp-adjacent moral support. And there was always one, let's call her Emily, who pinned in hairpins with the zen-like patience of someone who'd seen feuding duchesses and lived to tell the tale. Quiet, subtle, efficient, servants were the unsung conductors of this curious evening symphony. Once attired for maximum elegance and plausible culinary enjoyment, the descent to dinner began. Literally, down those aforementioned stairs. 2 banisters, 47 steps, perhaps a bust of a Roman emperor glowering disapprovingly at your elbow. This wasn't just walking, it was promenading. Though your shoes pinched and your garments whispered quiet threats, you sailed downward like the human embodiment of poise. At dinner, the stage was set. Epergnes glittered under candlelight, which flickered just enough to make you look younger, provided you squinted at your reflection in the silverware. The household's upper staff lined up just out of sight, ready to pass dishes, pour wine, and overhear things they'd recount later with suspicious accuracy. Lord Featherstone's remark about the Marquis's gout would be known in the scullery before dessert. Conversation at the table was governed by an unspoken script involving weather, mutual acquaintances, and mild gossip, so beige it was practically a wallpaper sample. No mention of bodily functions, politics, unless everyone agreed, or economic realities beyond the price of port. To be observed at dinner was to be both regal and ridiculous. A single wilted salad leaf on the lap could bring minor scandal. But oh, the cutlery choreography. A fork for fish, one for meat, a small, enigmatic spoon used once per lifetime and resented every time thereafter. Think of dinner as a ballet where no one moves much, but everyone's ankles hurt. As puddings arrived and glasses clinked gently beneath painted ceilings, the servants faded further into the background, agile shadows anticipating needs so subtle even you weren't sure if you had them. That's the artistry of it. Not just serving, but knowing, before you knew, that you were one sip of claret away from a nap you'd pretend you didn't need. And when the final course was cleared and someone suggested retiring to the drawing room, code for talking more loudly and sitting more uncomfortably, another portion of the household ballet would begin. But before that, just for a moment, you'd breathe in. Scented wax, roasted pheasant, gentle brass polish, and behind it all, the quiet symmetry of a household spinning on invisible gears. Soon, the guests would be guided toward parlors, salons, or, if feeling daring, the billiards room lit with gaslight and mischief, while the grand drawing room shimmered under a ceiling fresco that took 3 artists and 14 nervous apprentices to complete. Something far less magnificent was occurring just below the stairs. Sir Alistair Featherstone was conducting his clandestine nightly patrol to avoid slippers. You see, in a household with more than 20 servants, even a pair of slippers could attract an undue amount of attention. It wasn't that they were inherently dramatic, soft, velvet tufted and bespoke from Florence, but rather the way Sir Alistair had taken to hiding them. Not because he was eccentric. No, never that. But because 4 separate footmen had taken it upon themselves to fetch the master's slippers before he ever had a chance to put his own feet in them. It had become something of an unintentional foot race, with the poor man reduced to hiding his footwear behind pianofortes, under overstuffed ottomans, or once in the umbrella stand. The truth was that living under the loving surveillance of a modest army of staff created situations both luxurious and laughable. Privacy, that fine and elusive creature, was as rare in such homes as snow in Zanzibar. Domestic staff in large aristocratic houses weren't just hovering around waiting to pour tea or place doilies, though they did excel at both. They were human periscopes to the soul of the house, and nothing escaped them. If the lady of the house murmured in her sleep, there would be a footnote in the kitchen gossip ledger by morning. If the young master tried to sneak an extra fig from the conservatory, despite the purveyor's warning that they were expressly for display, the butler, the governess, and at least 2 parlourmaids would know before the fig had completed its descent. Even the humble act of sighing could become ammunition at the breakfast table. Lord Bevington sighed 3 times last evening by the north fireplace, a maid would whisper to another over a basin of lavender water. Could be indigestion or the Eastern question. Either way, it was best recorded and subtly passed along until it reached the cook, who might then decide to prepare lighter fare until the Lord's humours settled. And then there was the matter of letters, the lifeblood of Regency and Victorian social warfare. Each envelope sealed with wax could contain a proposal, an insult disguised as a compliment. Your new hat is so bracingly original. Or a reminder that someone had in fact not RSVP'd to Lady Mary's ball and was therefore skimming dangerously close to ostracism. Of course, most letters didn't remain secret for long. Stationery often spent a few unfortunate seconds longer than necessary in the hands of the footman delivering it. Not that they read them. Reading was strictly forbidden. They merely assessed the handwriting energetically, and perhaps gave the envelope a gentle shake to estimate contents. For preservation purposes, obviously, but what if, you wonder, one fancied a midnight stroll through the rose garden? A dusky promenade with only the moon and marzipan-scented night air to keep one company? Unlikely. Even the shrubbery had eyes. More specifically, a rotating trio of undergardeners, tasked with pruning everything from hedgerows to social faux pas. One such gardener, young Thomas Peckett, once intercepted the Earl's nephew as he attempted to meet a certain opera singer who had not, shall we say, been vetted for appropriate bloodlines. The Earl was never told. The singer compensated with a bouquet and a ticket to Naples, and young Thomas promoted for horticultural excellence, of course. Yet, amid this all-seeing gloved and laced network of awareness, there was also an elegant rhythm to the whole absurd ballet. If you dropped a spoon, someone heard it, picked it up, and polished it before you even said, "Oh." If you sighed, there was a cup of hot tea already in motion. If you got caught dancing in your dressing gown at 2 a.m. to a silent harpsichord, someone made sure you had warm slippers waiting once the embarrassment cooled. Because in a house that breathed with the motions of 20 invisible hands, there was both smothering surveillance and astonishing support. The price of privacy was paid in freshly ironed cravats and perfectly warmed bath towels. You might not be alone, but you were certainly never cold. And in case you were wondering what happened to the slippers, those elusive, velvet-napped fugitives of the feet, they were eventually discovered, re-abducted, and returned ceremoniously to Sir Alistair's bedroom with a handwritten note from the valet. "Henceforth, sir, your slippers shall be placed only by your own decree. Our apologies for the pursuit. The war was over. For now." Of course, all of this leads us gently to another delicate matter. What happened when the servants themselves began to gossip, not about the family, but about each other? And that, dear listener, is something we must tiptoe into next, as careful as placing a coffee spoon on a lace doily at midnight. On a soft spring morning in the year 1781, Lord Reginald Thistlewit of Berkshire had reached the end of a truly exhausting ordeal, changing his clothes for the 3rd time before breakfast. To the untrained eye, this may have looked like excessive finery, but to Reginald, it was simply survival. Dressed wrong in your own drawing room, and you might as well hand your peers a sword and invite them to duel your dignity. Now, to really understand the weight of getting dressed during this period and the army of servants who ensured you didn't inadvertently show up to tea wearing a riding coat indoors, scandalous, we must step into the understated grandeur of the dressing room. Dressing rooms were more than a place to put on clothes. They were sacred altars of self-construction, overseen by an elite cast of human wardrobe whisperers: the valet, the lady's maid, the hairdresser, the perfumer, and, if you were truly ambitious, the occasional visiting milliner who couldn't resist weighing in on your hat angles. A nobleman's valet was not just the guy who brought your breeches. He was, in essence, your romantic liaison to your own clothing. He knew which waistcoat made you look noble, yet approachable. Which cravat knot gave the impression that you had read Voltaire without being overly French about it. "Let's try the velvet with the Prussian buttons," the valet would whisper, with the gravity of a battlefield general eyeing the cavalry. "We mustn't look too Whig today. Not on Pheasant Day." Meanwhile, on the other side of the manor, the lady's maid was performing what amounted to 18-step rituals involving lace, corsets, hair powder, and a comb so fine it could part the Red Sea. Much like a valet, she was an arbiter of fashion, a keeper of secrets, and a force of terrifying efficiency. Forget to thank her for finding your misplaced garnet pin? She might, accidentally, lace your stays a bit tight. And of course, across the hallway of opulence and suppressed emotions, there was hair. Glorious, gravity-defying, powdered hair. Styled into landscapes, naval scenes, entire fictional vignettes perched on one's head like a theatrical performance. Hairdressers were often borrowed from the French courts or trained by them, artistic souls who sculpted with hairpins and hope. No hairstyle was too ridiculous, provided it could support a small porcelain birdcage with bird. This entire ensemble, valet, maid, hairdresser, perfumer, footman clutching a backup hat, was part of the great morning performance. And it was done so quietly, so efficiently, you could be spooning your porridge in the breakfast room by 9, looking effortlessly composed and only mildly haunted by decisions like stockings, white or cream. But with all these eager hands and flurried, Intentions orbiting your body like planets around a very tired sun. There was very little room for a spontaneity. Want to take a quick stroll? You needed boots. Boots meant a change of breeches, which meant summoning the valet again. Who would need to coordinate with the footman to track down the correct walking stick? The ash one, not the yew one. We're not savages. That's 15 extra minutes just to watch ducks in the pond. 20 if your hat feathers look too Republican. Yet for the upper crust of Georgian society, it wasn't just about looking proper. It was about moving through the world like an artwork. Carefully curated, elaborately framed, and critically reviewed by every other oversized wig in the conservatory. The pressure was constant, and the servant staff, while indispensable, were ever watching. A hiccup captured by the third underfootman could be gossiped about in 3 counties by Thursday. Still, for all its regimented luxury, many aristos grew, oddly fond of their daily ensemble of helpers. There was intimacy in having someone fold your cuffs just so. A quiet camaraderie, in the act of doing nothing simple alone, even if it meant being occasionally scolded for daring to think mauve could be worn before Michaelmas. So the next time you struggle to choose between 2 nearly identical sweaters before a Zoom meeting, remember Lord Thistlewit, having a mild breakdown over sock embroidery, surrounded by 4 servants debating the metaphysical question. Does this waistcoat say regal or desperate for inheritance? Let's follow Reginald a little further into his day, past the wardrobe battles, as he enters another space where dignity was both designed and dismantled. The parlour. As dusk coloured the edges of the sky, warm apricot and ash, and the scullery maids lit the last of the hallway candles, the great house performed one of its most theatrical and delicate daily rituals. Dressing the master for dinner. Not preparing dinner, mind you. That was chaos hidden behind kitchen doors. This was preening for the meal itself, a practiced symphony of silk waistcoats, imported pomade, and more social anxiety than the London season in full swing. Now, while much is made of the grand galas and glittering aristocrats twirling under chandeliers like socially anxious peacocks, few dwell on the quiet, deeply choreographed moments that made such displays even possible. Behind every cravat that looked effortlessly askew was a valet with nimble fingers and a soul simply weary of starch. Enter Sir Reginald. Mid-50s, very wealthy, vaguely mustachioed, a man who could recite Cicero while being waxed. Tonight, he would be attending a dinner party held in his honor. He did not particularly enjoy dinner parties, but he did enjoy being honored, and that made all the difference. He stood in front of a full-length mirror, arms slightly up, as if awaiting an embrace from someone who was running, say-il permanently late. Around him, 3 servants buzzed with industrious silence. Johnson, the valet, had been with Sir Reginald since his Oxford days and knew the man's wardrobe so intimately, he often found himself dreaming in waistcoat textures. This evening's choice was the plum brocade with gold threading, a garment so heavy it might have legally counted as small furniture. Too much? Sir Reginald asked delicately, as though his reflection might gasp. Johnson gave a shrug, ever careful. Perhaps festive, sir, but the cook did mention syllabub, and it does echo the zest of the evening. Syllabub-themed attire was not uncommon among the gentry. There was, after all, very little else to do with one's day afternoon besides commit to a theme. Shoes next. The evening pumps had been soot-blackened with a squirrel hairbrush. Yes, squirrel. Cats were soft but deemed unreliable, and buffed to a shine so smooth Sir Reginald could see his soul blink back at him. Downstairs, Mrs. Higginbotham, the housekeeper, orchestrated the seating arrangements with all the calm of a general at war. She had placed the bishop next to Lady Fenwick, knowing full well she would bring up her spiritualist seances after the soup course. It would cause exactly the right amount of scandal, enough to trigger 2 monocles into flight, but not enough to derail pudding. "Does the bishop eat aspic?" she whispered over a ledger too detailed to belong to anyone sane. The footman shrugged. No idea. Sir Reginald does, ma'am. Helpful, she muttered, though he also enjoys pickled walnuts. Can't trust taste that bends that way. Upstairs, the cologne was uncorked, something French and dramatically named. Possibly regret de minuit or damp forest longing. It was applied sparingly, just enough waft to suggest wealth and mystery, but not so much as to declare war on the guests' noses. A valet's final task before dinner was the hallowed jab pocket inventory. This consisted of inspecting the pockets of waistcoat and breeches, left, right, breast, hidden, checking they contained just the right mix of utility and flair. A monogrammed handkerchief, a sovereign or two to jingle impressively, a sugar cube for emergencies or horses, and of course, the snuff box. Tonight's box was tortoiseshell with inlaid mother of pearl, a subtle flex. Not too ostentatious, just disposable ivory chic. As Sir Reginald turned from the mirror, fully encased in ceremonial fabric, he gave a quiet sigh. "You know," he said, accepting the final dab of powder to the temples, "sometimes I envy the kitchen cat. No obligations, no waistcoats, just mice, naps and the occasional stolen herring." Johnson blinked once. "Very good, sir. But I dare say the cat has not been invited to dine with the Duke of Arminster." Sir Reginald smiled. "Pity. The thing has remarkably good table manners." Down in the kitchen corridor, the youngest scullery boy darted past with a tray of candied violets, nearly colliding with the butler who carried a pewter dish as seriously as a man cradles a state secret. Every tray, every pocket, every candle flame was part of a softly ticking mechanism, one that ensured the great household appeared as effortless as a breeze. But behind the curtain, the servants rehearsed every line, fluffed every napkin, and choreographed each swish of the host's ornate coattails. And so, as the dinner gong was primed to chime, and Sir Reginald descended the grand staircase at a pace somewhere between royal and rheumatic, the house prepared to dazzle. All 20-something servants, invisible and always one step ahead, had set the stage for the performance called dinner. But elsewhere, in the drawing room beyond the double doors, a less expected drama was brewing. All unknowingly, the first guest had arrived early, and she was already rearranging the furniture. In the grand orchestral machinery of an aristocratic household, few instruments were tuned as precisely, and yet squeaked as endearingly, as the bell pull system. It was the Wi-Fi of the manor. Only instead of routers and pings, it involved an alarming number of cords, levers and servants leaping up from their greatly interrupted tea. Imagine this. You in your four-poster bed, wrapped in damask and ennui, craving a slice of plum cake or warmer feet. You reach beside your bed for a velvet rope, give it a dainty yet decisive tug, and somewhere 3 floors below, a tiny copper bell quivers like a nervous mouse. Mrs. Paddington, the second under housemaid, eyes widen. She knows that's the Duke's slipper bell, and it tolls not for thee, but for Sir Cold Toes himself. Each bell was labelled in the servants' hall with a neat brass plate: library, morning room, east boudoir, Her Grace, and unused parlour with wobbling table. They dangled in rows like metallic fruit, and when one rang, the servant stationed nearest had exactly 12 seconds to get moving, lest the master think his dignity has somehow evaporated thanks to sluggish service. Sometimes, in a fit of Victorian mischief, multiple bells would ring at once, a real domestic symphony. In one infamous morning in 1874, Lady Eglantine of Chipping Norton managed to yank 4 different chords in quick succession, trying to alert her lady's maid to an escaped, very large spider. Legend has it that 6 servants burst into her dressing room at once, one with a broom, one with a net, one with a tea tray, and 3 with vague moral support. The spider escaped unharmed. The tea did not. But it wasn't just chaos and ankles running through corridors. There was etiquette to this madness. Bell rings from the nursery were considered urgent, Sticky situations, you see, whereas bell rings from the billiard room often meant the gentleman had sunk more brandy than balls and required someone to gently extract them from their crushed velvet chairs. Of course, not all households were as buttoned up or as efficient. In some homes, bells were notorious for being almost entirely ignored. In 1836, a low-ranking baronet complained bitterly in his diary that the bell to his smoking room hadn't been answered in over 45 minutes. The footman later confessed the bell had been put to sleep, which was a polite way of saying it had been stuffed with handkerchiefs to stop it jangling altogether. But perhaps the most curious phenomenon of the bell system wasn't how often it worked, but when it worked too well. One clever lady's maid, Miss Judith Featherstone, prided herself on appearing within 8 seconds of any bell ring. This, she said, made her both invaluable and slightly terrifying. "She must live in the walls," muttered one footman, anxiously checking the wainscoting. Meanwhile, over in kitchens below the kitchens, yes, the further below than below kitchens, qualified household engineers maintained the ropes and pulleys like ancient monks maintaining sacred scrolls. Over time, the ropes might fray or even tangle with alarming consequences. A tug for tea might accidentally summon the coachman to the conservatory, prompting a lecture on vehicular inappropriateness indoors from the butler. And speaking of the butler, he was the bell whisperer. He didn't just hear bells, he interpreted them. A longer jangle meant impatience. A double ring might be an accidental tug from Lady Arabelle's dog. And a silent bell, well, that was cause for concern. If the drawing room bell didn't swing by 5 o'clock, someone went to check if the lady of the house had nodded off face first into her embroidery, as had happened one rather inconvenient Tuesday. Over time, as electrical systems replaced the ropes and servants became scarcer, the bellboards fell silent. Some homes left them exactly where they were, a remnant of the analog age, a little museum of moods and mishaps, a whisper of a time when summoning a person required not a mobile phone, but a flick of the wrist and enough status to justify interrupting someone else's day with your desire for tea, warmth, or spider-related rescue operations. As night falls gently over the grand halls and the bells settle into their cobwebbed slumber, we linger briefly at the kitchen stairs. For just beyond those steps lies another ghost of daily rhythm, one equally shrouded in tedium, splendor, and the pursuit of very hot breakfast. The post-breakfast hour in a grand 18th century household was a peculiar interval, wedged snugly between the smouldering aftermath of servants clearing toast crumbs and the looming horizon of pre-lunch social obligations. This was the atmospheric lull where the house, a baroque beehive of creaky staircases and whispered footsteps, seemed to hold its breath, allowing its inhabitants, chiefly the lady of the house, to perform their most sacred duty of all, doing absolutely nothing, but with flair. Lady Persephone Harrington Thistlethwaite, yes, those names did accumulate like dust in the corners of a drawing room, would retreat each morning to her withdrawing room, a space so named not because one did anything practical in it, but because one withdrew from the terrifying prospect of effort. The room was upholstered in mauve silks that faded, 6 decades deep into fashionable oblivion, and arranged with chairs no one dared sit on, because they were so delicate they might faint. Here, Lady Persephone would practice being decorative. And dear listener, this was an art in itself. To recline attractively on a chaise longue while appearing no less than elegant, yet faintly unapproachable, was a cultivated skill. She would sip, or more accurately, waft, her tea, allowing just enough steam to lick her cheekbones, because a warm visage gave the appearance of maternal nobility, even if one had never raised a finger for so much as a button. Yet even this solitary dawdling was performed under the keen gaze of staff. Behind her and slightly to the left sat Hortense, the lady's maid, pretending not to look at anything while expertly tracking every movement in the ornate mirror. Should Lady Persephone tilt her head 1 degree to the south-southeast, Hortense would be there with a fresh silk cushion and a murmured, "Very good, ma'am," as if Persephone had just composed a sonata rather than slightly repositioned her hair. Servants in such homes often mastered the art of purposeful invisibility. They were always there, like moral support or overqualified poltergeists, but never truly in the foreground. The trick, you see, was to remain unobtrusive while anticipating needs the master or mistress themselves had not yet thought of. A glove buffed before it knew it was scuffed. A fire stoked before the room felt chilly. A letter penned before even the faintest intention to express sentiment bloomed. This chapter of the day was also prime time for the delivery of correspondence, a social practice that was 30% affection, 20% passive aggression, and the remaining 50% outright strategy. Letters arrived with all the subtlety of cannon fire, carried in on silver trays with enough ceremony to suggest they'd been penned by Caesar himself, rather than a marquis with too much time and gout. One such letter, delivered by footman Basil, who looked as though he'd personally lost at love and was still thinking about it, would arrive just as Lady Persephone flicked through a book she had no intention of reading. It was tied with the dreaded rose-pink ribbon, a colour that meant either an invitation or a duel, though it was often difficult to tell the difference. Lady Persephone opened it with the gravity of a woman unfurling ancient prophecy, read 2 lines, raised an eyebrow so imperceptibly that only Hortense clocked it, and returned the letter to its envelope with all the drama of someone dusting off. Moonlight. Lady Allington, she muttered, plans a musical. No further commentary needed. The words hung in the perfumed air like a faintly suspected mist. Hortense clicked her tongue with an understanding that covered both musical tastes and centuries of class resentment. Somewhere in the distance, a piano sighed. Musicales, it was generally agreed, were social landmines disguised as entertainment. One might be required to listen, or worse, perform. And while mastering the pianoforte was the mark of an accomplished young lady, hearing Mistress Elspeth Bumblethorpe struggle through a Handel fugue with the urgency of someone chasing a squirrel, well, it could drive even the kindest soul to consider roofing alternatives. Persephone, however, was undeterred. She would attend, as was her duty. The trick was to be seen, say nothing of consequence, and leave just early enough to suggest an appointment with someone slightly more important than everyone else in the room. Such was the dance. Outside, a dull drizzle began to freckle the windows, as though the world itself had grown sleepy with respect for the day's ambitions. Now, as a dressing bell softly chimed in the hallway, a cue for the next costume change, as if the household were an opera rehearsal that never quite premiered, Persephone rose, or rather, allowed herself to be assisted into rising. Downstairs, preparations were already underway for luncheon. But that, of course, is another performance entirely. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in the life of a Georgian noble, and by ordinary, I mean orchestrated within an inch of its extravagant, embroidered life. The sun had barely made its yawning way over the horizon, but the house was already abuzz with white-gloved industry. Somewhere behind the heavy velvet curtains, the footmen were polishing the same already shining brass banister, and the scullery maid, one of the lowest in the pecking order, poor thing, was either scouring yet another unnecessarily complicated soup tureen, or weeping softly into a bin of wet potatoes. You, of course, were still in bed. Not because you were lazy. Heavens, no. You were merely biding your time, waiting for that very delicate balance of the household cogwheel to spin into its morning groove. First came the maid who cleared out the chamber pot. You always pretended to be asleep during this transaction. Then the valet or lady's maid with the basin of warm water and a cool, murmured, "Good morning, sir," or "My lady," depending on the state of your velvet nightwear. The process of getting dressed in a house like this was less slipping on something comfortable and more conducting a performance of sartorial difficulty. If you were a gentleman, the valet had already laid out the day's attire several steps ahead: linen shirt, stockings wound like scrolls, the burgundy waistcoat with the mother-of-pearl buttons you forgot you owned, breeches, boots, gloves, hat, and wig. Yes, wig. Because nothing says, "I'm ready for an afternoon of crushing debt and tepid tea," like a full, powdered, and meticulously curled hairpiece anchored to the back of your skull with suspicious pins. Ladies did not have it easier. In fact, they rarely had it without bruised ribs. Several maids were required to negotiate the full rigmarole: chemise, stays, panniers like sideways accordions, overdress, underdress, petticoats, fichu, pearls, gloves, fans, and of course, the towering hairstyle, stiff with pomade, possibly harboring a small bird, depending on the fashion week. Breakfast, when it arrived, carried in by one or two unfailingly punctual footmen, was a delight as much for its ceremony as for its contents. A single egg had never taken so many people to arrive at the table with such flair. Toast was triangulated to papal precision, and the jam favoured by the Duchess's second cousin in Sussex was, somehow, already sitting on the silver tray. Had travelled 75 miles. High-speed jam delivery, courtesy of the servant Grapevine. As you sat in your dressing gown, sipping tea and gazing vaguely out the window at nothing in particular, your servants sprang into their next formation, refilling hot water jugs and plumping things that did not need plumping. Did the sofa's left cushion really require 3 fluffings? Apparently, yes. All of this attentiveness created a curious sense of surveillance. You, the master or mistress of the house, were never truly alone. The very act of solitude had a staff schedule. One left just after replacing a log in the fireplace, another hovered as you happened upon a book you were gently encouraged to read. Privacy was a concept that existed mostly in poetry and poor neighborhoods. And yet, this odd, orchestrated voyeurism was considered a luxury. Being constantly watched wasn't alarming, it was convenient. If emotion struck you and you dared to sigh, someone 2 rooms away might hear it and arrive with a tincture of cardamom or your sketching book. If you spilled ink, a cloth was in your hand before you'd said, "Oh, bother." It was as though one's very life came with invisible subtitles for comfort and dependency. Naturally, with so many moving parts in the household machinery, miscommunication became its own kind of bedtime story. Imagine attempting to throw an impromptu lunch when the butler abhors spontaneity, or convincing the flower maid that your headache does not require 7 fresh vases of lilacs in your chamber. You didn't live with 20+ servants. You lived inside a breathing, sighing, faintly irritated opera, where you played the lead, and everyone else was both audience and understudy. And through it all, there was the constant rustle of skirts brushing corridors, of shined shoes on polished floors, of hushed discussions below stairs that started with, "Did you hear?" and ended inevitably with someone being mildly scandalized. As the sun filtered into the room in thin, golden streaks, you rose, fashionably late, and began what would be an exhaustingly languid day. First a ride, then a letter-writing hour, then the business of deciding which room to pretend to read in. Which, incidentally, brings us to the delicate business of the drawing room, and the gentle art of appearing far more intelligent than you actually felt. But that, dear sleeper, is a tale worth whispering next. By the time the afternoon sun filtered softly through the leaded glass windows, casting wobbly lines upon the polished oak floors, the manor's daily rhythm had entered its most curious ritual: the search for the missing spoon. Not just any spoon, a silver Demeter spoon engraved with a family crest that no one could quite identify anymore. Some thought it was a lion clutching a turnip. Others insisted it was simply a rat with good posture. In a house governed by over 20 gliding, ever-busy servants, losing an item was a bit like misplacing a whisper in a cathedral. The butler, Mr. Harrow, launched a quiet investigation. He suspected the scullery maid, who suspected the under-footman, who had recently developed a suspicious affinity for tea-time trinkets after becoming obsessed with French etiquette manuals. Every corner of the estate was thoroughly turned out. from ornately carved escritoires to the pantry's biscuit barrel, all swept with the kind of care you'd expect when national secrets were at stake. And all this drama over a spoon. Yet that was the gravitational oddity of life in such houses. Small events took on monumentally operatic proportions because everything else had already been done for you. You didn't have to fetch your own slippers. You didn't have to remember to eat. The cook would clang the breakfast bell before your stomach so much as whispered. When every practical need is anticipated, the mind searches for some unsolved mystery to nibble on. And what better mystery than a vanishing flatware? Meanwhile, the lady of the house, Lady Prunella Doddington Bige, was halfway through writing a letter to her cousin Hortense. She had been halfway through this letter for 12 days. The inkwell was always refilled before she noticed it had run dry, and the quill was fluffed and trimmed hourly by a valet named Cedric, who had aspirations of becoming a poet, but was instead gainfully employed preening instruments of correspondence. "My dearest Hortense," she mouthed again, eternally stuck on the opening. Really, it was hard to concentrate when there were so many people checking for dust on your mouldings. Elsewhere in the house, the servants had formed a sort of gentle conspiracy to keep things interesting. Barney, a livery-wearing footman with a fondness for riddles, had tucked a small poem inside Lord Doddington Bige's favourite gardening glove. The poem promised that a treasure lies where gooseberries dream, which flustered the master for the better part of the afternoon. He eventually went on a silent, intensely determined patrol through the greenhouse, upending several planters and interrogating a rather sleepy tortoise named Admiral Blenkinsop. Now, don't get the wrong idea. Chaos didn't reign precisely. Rather, it pirouetted politely in the margins, with so many people maintaining everything from boots to banisters, from hedges to habits. You begin to lose track of what's ordinary. And sometimes, the ordinary starts craving the extraordinary. Take the parlour, for example. Recently, Mrs. Darling, the housekeeper and controlling force behind all linen-related phenomena, had developed a secret craving for escapism. She began leaving miniature scenes on end tables. A ceramic mouse with a tiny painted carriage, a teaspoon planted in a napkin as if it were a daffodil. Nobody ever acknowledged them, but everyone noticed. They had to. There wasn't much else to do. In such grand houses, one didn't so much live as become a live stream for others' efficiency. The household breathed as one impossibly complicated, grimly polite organism. If you so much as opened a book, someone was already preparing your shawl and warming brandy by the fire in case the content grew too stirring. Decide to take a walk. A footman and a spare walking stick were likely posted at the door, just in case of a sudden whim. And so, under the immense quilt of normalcy, servant-run homes often blossomed tiny rebellions. A jam tart with an unusual filling. A garden gnome dressed as a naval admiral. Mild and sleepy forms of defiance that offered sparkling moments of fun amid the starch and silence. The missing silver spoon, by the way, had been tucked behind a curtain rod after Lady Prunella mistook it for a letter opener during a creative frenzy. The mystery was never solved, nor was it supposed to be. Some things were better left unfiled in the great cabinet of household truths. As twilight arrived and the fire, she crackled into its nightly monologue. The manor sighed into stillness once more. Somewhere, sheets were being turned down just so. Boots stood empty like sentinels, and the wind fussed gently at the eaves, as if deciding whether to knock. Tomorrow, perhaps, a new mystery would stir under the chandelier. Or maybe, just maybe, the tortoise would finally reach the rosebed. Either way, the house was ready and watching. They say the walls have ears. But in an English country manor of 1787, the curtains had eyes, the floors had ears, and even the breadbasket might be on speaking terms with the valet. In homes with 20 or more servants, privacy was more concept than reality, like a unicorn or a polite goose. You might think that being wealthier than a minor duke would get you a measure of alone time, but no. Not when Edward the bootboy is shining your shoes under the bed at sunrise, and Miss Elspeth the chambermaid is already back from prayers by the time your wig is properly powdered. Now, to call it living in luxury is technically accurate, provided you like being perpetually observed, fed, dressed, and undressed with all the autonomy of a rather stylish sock puppet. Let's drift into the drawing room, shall we? Picture Lady Agatha, seated on her prized Émile Jacques Rouleman fauteuil, which no one can pronounce, and even fewer are allowed to sit on. She is mid-swoon over a letter from her cousin Mildred, who is rumoured to have dined with a viscount, and used the dessert fork for fish. Scandalous. But Agatha dares not gasp aloud, for 3 footmen are in attendance, pretending to polish candlesticks, and they take private delight in cataloguing the nobility's subtler embarrassments. You see, in these grand homes, the servants' corridors and the master's chambers often overlapped like layers of a particularly nosy lasagna. Hidden doors, false panels, and narrow staircases were everywhere, running along the edges of the manor like nerves, its veins. Servants were trained to be invisible, quiet, omnipresent, and exceptionally judgmental. A well-trained butler in 1802 could glide through dinner service with such eerie silence that guests thought the gravy ladled itself. But in reality, he was listening, taking mental notes for the housekeeper, and already planning how to detour Lady Agatha's pet greyhound from relieving itself behind the Grecian urn near the Harewood console. Of course, the futility of secrets didn't stop people from trying. Wealthy gentlemen often attempted clandestine romances, or at least awkward trysts behind tall potted ferns. But somewhere, just out of sight, was always cook's undermaid with a dustpan and a vivid memory. There's one rather fun account from 1794 of a baron attempting a hasty moonlit rendezvous by climbing out his window only to be handed his boots at the bottom by the gardener, who simply said, "Very good, your lordship," and returned to watering the roses. Bedrooms, the Ziet's supposed sanctuaries, were rarely visited alone. A lady's toilette involved an all-female audience who managed her gowns, her lotions, her rogue, blush, not mischief, though sometimes both, and most critically, her corset. 2 women were often required just to lace a corset properly, unless you preferred your ribs realigned with every breath. Privacy was traded for posture and perfection. This constant attention gave rise to an art, the studied performance of nonchalance. It was widely acknowledged in upper-class circles that the only thing more gauche than acknowledging your servants was acknowledging that you knew they knew everything. Nobility developed a sort of theatrical aloofness, floating from rooms as though on rails, pretending they'd dressed themselves, done their own hair, and poured their own tea, which was, quite obviously, not the case. At breakfast, one might chew toast in deliberate philosophical silence, while 4 servants refilled water glasses and A quietly judged your choice of cravat. The most skilled among the upper crust learned to do nothing with such grace and gravitas that it impressed other people into doing things for them. It was not so much laziness as weaponized elegance. But let us not be unfair. There was, in many homes, a mutual if unspoken civility. The best households ran on rituals of polite illusion, masters pretending they weren't helpless, and servants pretending they weren't in charge. This odd social contract held firm as long as no one addressed the fact that the person sharpening your dining knives also knew where your wig was stored. Tonight, as you lay your head on that imagined feather pillow from Lord Bellington's guest suite, let your mind drift through the echoing corridors of the Great Hall, where a lone scullery maid extinguishes the last candle, and a steward below stairs prepares the household ledger, because nothing says tranquility quite like an indexed account of who misplaced the silver mustard spoon. Now let's follow the hush of night beyond the velvet drapes and into the heart of the kitchen, where quiet revolutions were always brewing over leftover pigeon pie and a well-earned second cup of tea. Evening had settled like a velvet shawl over the country estate, and behind ivy-laced windows, another wildly uneventful dinner had just taken place. The chandeliers had done their usual trick of looking expensive while flickering apologetically, and the roast duck had arrived precisely 7 seconds late, prompting cook to greet the footman with a look suggesting she'd consider resigning in protest or fainting, whichever seemed more dramatic. You, of course, as the master, or mistress, of this be-windowed manor, had noticed none of it. At least, not consciously. Because living with over 20 servants means developing a strangely refined blindness. A teacup refills itself. Pillow fluffing occurs like magic. A pair of gloves misplaced in the piano room ends up 2 hours later back in your dressing table drawer, arranged by color and silently judged by a housemaid named Edna, who insists she once saw Queen Victoria from a great distance and remains proud of the memory. Now, as you stroll through the drawing room, you are, in effect, conducting a never-ending symphony of unspoken expectations. You don't say a word, but your presence sets off a choreography. Rugs are being straightened, window drapes fluffed, and the one footman who's in love with the upstairs maid momentarily forgets to dust the third shelf. Scandalous. Ceilings in these homes are higher than the average strength of a Victorian moral code, and the air forever smells slightly of lavender sachets and very old money. The walls have ears, and many of those ears belong to maids disguised as monarch-era ghosts galloping through corridors with feather dusters. But let's talk about a particularly delicate daily ballet. Bath time. To bathe, you didn't simply hop into the tub. No, that would imply spontaneity, a quality thoroughly banned from polite society after the Napoleonic Wars. Instead, the ritual involved a committee of invisible coordinators. First, the lady's maid must announce bath intentions, lightly, like a secret pastry order. Then the second housemaid sets off to fetch water, which is heated over the same kitchen hearth, recently occupied by 3 loaves of bread and a marmalade experiment that went terribly wrong. Meanwhile, the first footman lugs steaming pitchers up the stairs like a boiled beverage butler. The copper tub, which weighs more than a mildly annoyed cow, must be arranged in your chamber, and not a moment too soon, lest you be confronted by the horror of lukewarm water and social ruination. Do you run your own bath? Of course not. That would be unseemly. Your hands only touch books, letters from your cousin in Sussex who insists she's not secretly French, and small dogs with complicated names like Chipomplemousse. Bathwater temperature is determined not by thermometer, but by intuition, panic, and the experience of having once outraged a baronet by making it a bit nippy. The lady's maid will test it with a pinky, gasp, nod solemnly, then declare it perfect, which in servant code means, I give up, it's warm enough, and my fingers are melting. You step in, and for the next 23 minutes, the household pauses. Servants hold their breath. The cat skitters away. The dowager aunt, who pretends not to drink sherry, peers sternly into a book she's holding upside down. Because the problem with regular bath takers like yourself, particularly among the society elite, is that they have a tendency to feel extremely philosophical post-soak. That's when things get dangerous. You might announce you're taking up poetry, or archery, or abolishing pheasant shooting in favor of interpretive dance. Worse yet, you may demand, over your lavender-scented shoulder, that your silk underthings be pressed differently, diagonally, like the Emperor of Brazil used to prefer. This will spark a whisper cascade throughout the servants' quarters, lasting well into the night, ending only when the stable boy declares he doesn't know what diagonally is and refuses to learn on principle. And all the while, the house hums softly with the business of watching you not notice things. 20-something pairs of eyes await your next vanished sigh, your next semi-conscious glance at a teacup, your next change of mood over the weather. It's a house tuned to the key of your unspoken whims. But now, as you recline against a tufted chaise, flanked by embroidered cushions created by a seamstress who once stitched for a neglected archduchess, everything grows still. A candle flickers in its sconced cradle. Rain tiptoes against the window in perfectly aristocratic drizzle. In the scullery, someone drops a pot, and 6 people pretend they didn't hear it. The hour is late, the manor breathing in deep and quiet, And just down the corridor, currently waiting with a sense of dread and duty, are the people who must soon prepare your traveling trunk for tomorrow's visit, to the cousin who insists on embroidery lessons and whose mice wear little bonnets. But we'll get to that next. With the sun reclining over the hills and the house bathed in an amber hush, it was finally the hour when the stately silence of old aristocratic homes grew even more pronounced, save of course for the rustle of gowns, the spritz of lemon water for rinsed fingers, and the subtle panic of footmen realizing they'd placed the wrong cutlery for the third night in a row. Evening with 20+ servants in the house was not so much a peaceful occasion as it was a theatrical production. The great dinner bell rang at 7, and within minutes the drawing room transformed into a pageant of precision. Napkins were starched to architectural rigidity. Candles flickered on silver sconces with the solemnity of a cathedral, and somewhere down in the servant halls, a scullery maid was praying not to overboil the celeriac again. Let me describe this carefully coordinated chaos to you in a way that won't alarm your sleep. For the lord or lady of the house, dinner was a sacred performance, one seldom seen without an embroidered waistcoat or Duchess satin. At the long mahogany table, longer than a canal boat but less seaworthy, guests would be seated with meticulous intent. You did not simply sit next to your friend. You sat according to wealth, breeding, and whether your family's winter estate included stables. The servants, of course, were the invisible cast of this production, but invisibility required intense effort. A footman might spend 30 minutes adjusting the wick of a lamp just to ensure the lady's diamonds caught the right sparkle when she gestured toward the custard. That same footman might spend the next hour standing motionless behind a chair, only twitching slightly when the family terrier attempted to seat itself on his foot. And then there was the ritual of removing the courses. In grand houses, it wasn't simply a matter of clearing the table. No, dear listener, it was closer to an exorcism of unwanted dishes. One wave of the butler's white-gloved hand and in swooped a battalion of staff, each trained to lift a plate as quietly as a shadow falls. Now you may have heard of the banana, common, humble breakfast table fare today. But in the 19th century English dining room, a banana was essentially an enchanted artifact imported through great peril, crossing oceans, empires, and likely mold. Once received, it would be sliced delicately and served in a footed crystal bowl, which 2 footmen might carry together, lest its glory blind someone or, worse, slip off the linen. Of course, while the gentry dined and discoursed, often about matters like the superiority of an east versus south-facing conservatory, the servants below were conducting a merry chaos of their own. The kitchen buzzed like a madrigal gone wrong. The cook, a woman of stout opinion and even stouter sherry habits, barked orders through clouds of flour. One boy was instructed to run outside for fresh herbs, and upon returning was congratulated, only to learn they'd been out of parsley since Tuesday. It wasn't just the cooks and footmen engaged in the evening's theatre. Valets lurked near dressing rooms to assist with the mysterious undressing process, because apparently unlacing one's own boots was a scandalous act of rebellion. Maids tidied chambers, not just once, but in rounds. Candlesticks were trimmed, coal scuttles scrubbed, slippers pre-warmed, and frilled nightcaps laid out like delicate bonnets for a bedtime brigade. At bedtime, the house creaked like a contented cat. The gentry sank into feather down and dreams of fox hunts, or perhaps the pleasure of reminding someone tomorrow that their family only had one governess. The servants, in turn, tiptoed through corridors, extinguishing 100 candles by hand, rehearsing in their heads the proper order of breakfast trays for the morning. And so the house, this grand machine of bone china ritual and velvet-clad choreography, settled slowly into slumber. Outside, owls regarded the chimneys with vague curiosity. But indoors, behind brocade and baies and portieres that swallowed sound, the servant bells were finally still. And with the hush growing thicker, like cream on a good syllabub, we draw the curtains gently on the day's end. Yet before sleep arrives completely, there's one more soft detail to light like a candle before dawn. And so, as the candle burned low and the domestics padded off to their tucked-away quarters like well-trained phantoms in slippers, the grand household began to exhale. There were still a few lingering chores, polishing silver that had never been tarnished, aligning books that no one dared to read, but the great machine of domesticity was slowing for the night. Now, imagine you're lying in bed, a four-poster monstrosity with curtains so thick they'd make a vampire feel right at home. The mattress is stuffed with enough goose feathers to resettle an entire pond, and there's a warming pan tucked near your feet, a copper saucer filled with embers, swirled round by a yawning chambermaid whose only true wish is that her shift was over. Outside, a coach rattles by, disturbing the silence only briefly. In a house serviced by over 20 staff members, footmen, valets, scullions, and someone unnecessarily referred to as a powder room steward, your solitude is as strategic as it is sacred. A valet has already removed your cravat with the tenderness of a hostage negotiator. The housekeeper has ensured there's lavender water on the side table, chilled just so, because you once mentioned your aunt liked it. The butler, having ordered his own hierarchy to fold in for the night, pensively sips a stolen drop of sherry from behind the decanter, pretending he's still needed in case you summon a midnight melon. The servants sleeping in dormer rooms above rarely appeared in daylight. They were like the moon, seen, if lucky, only in reflection. Their lives were dictated by bells, little brass tyrants installed in every room, each with a silken pull string and a mood of its own. One bell meant tea. 2 bells meant a displeasing breeze. 3 bells, heaven forbid, meant a guest needed help tying a cravat and dressing a philosophical crisis simultaneously. You, the master or mistress of the estate, knew little of how they worked, only that they did. Salt cellars filled themselves. Boots were miraculously shined by dawn. Letters found their way into pools of wax and stamps without you ever noticing a hand. It was a strange art. This living with dozens of eyes always lurking and yet never looking. Servants were expected to perfect the tightrope walk of omnipresent invisibility. They stood straighter for your entrance, vanished faster than your appetite when a boiled turnip appeared. And yes, every gesture, from the slice of your pudding to the sigh before retiring, went into an invisible ledger they all somehow shared. Was your cough scratchier tonight than usual? Whispered discussions in the kitchen would determine whether lamb stew was too rich. Did you leave a letter unopened on your desk for 3 days? Great debates were held beneath stairs about whether the news therein was too painful, or simply tedious. Yet among all the watchfulness and polish and hierarchical absurdities, something tender glimmered in the candlelit nonsense, the unspoken agreements, the nightly routines, the buttonholes mended in silence, the coal fires lit before toes touched the floor, the orchestration of comfort authored by countless hands you knew only by roles like third footman or Ethel from Linens. You may never learn their dreams, and they'll never see your vulnerabilities uncovered. But in these twilit halls of quiet creaks and soft slippers, there existed a curious intimacy, one that wrapped around you gently like a warm shawl, woven not of affection, but of predictability, of small kindnesses, of 1,000 tasks completed without expectation nor applause. Now, as arguments over tea strength drift off with the steam, and the bells finally give up their pleas, you turn toward the heavy drapery, now brushing at moonlight. The pillow sinks just the right amount beneath you, as if someone had measured the weight of your thoughts before fluffing. Somewhere within the walls, a clock strikes midnight. A long pause follows, as if even the pendulum has grown sleepy. The house sighs. So do you. And finally, with the fire fading to embers and the last rustles of linen-draped figures settling into stillness, you close your eyes. 20 or more people might still be listening, somewhere between duty and dreams. But for now, you are alone, beautifully alone, in the quiet heart of history's oddest hug. Sleep tight,